If we were to rename these stories, week 1 will be something like The Tenacious Friends. Week 2, we might call it The Prodigal God. Week 3, we might call it The Despairing Prophet. Today, I would call it The Incompetent Priest and a Stiff-Necked People. And I have to admit that I kind of connect with incompetent priesthood. I've had my own moments of incompetence as a leader. And anyone in leadership knows that you have also. Now, I have a special heart for religious leadership, and I'm a little geeky about it. I love shows that portray religious leadership. I love to watch them and then critique them. Go like, there's no way a pastor would ever do that. Also critique the theology, going like, well, there's no way, that's not theologically correct. Recently, I've been into Father Brown from the BBC. Not because I want to be a, pastor who solves murders, although that would be kind of cool. But because I love, it's one of the few shows I've watched where they get a sense of pastoral life that it's so on it. The rhythms of leadership, the theological struggles, the real encounters with people. So I get Aaron. I can almost feel in my bones how he was feeling. I have a visceral response to this text because I've been in that place in leadership where the heat has been turned on, where things are not going like they should, and people demanding answers. I understand what it's like to kind of not know exactly what's going on and not know what to do, but people are demanding things and giving you ideas about things. And I can even imagine the first few days were not a huge ordeal, but once the days started stacking up on each other, Aaron was really in a position that he almost could not win. The pressure was too much. A few days ago, Facebook Memories gifted me with a picture of me about 6 years ago. The photographer was a member of the congregation who gifted us with pictures of worship each week. And he just roamed the congregation during the different worship services and took snapshots of life together. And on this day, he came behind me. Ooh, I almost killed myself there. He came behind me and took a snapshot. And I looked very pensive. It was a few minutes before I was to preach. For the average observer, they would think, oh, Pastor Juan Carlos is getting his heart prepared for worship. What he didn't know was that he took a snapshot of the worst day in my pastoral life. That moment that he took a snapshot on was the moment when I was wondering deep within my soul whether I had an enemy to proclaim good news on that day. In that very moment that he took that snapshot, what was running through my mind was, I think that I'm not ready to preach the good news on this day. I just want to run away and never return to this vocation. In that moment, when he took that snapshot, what was running through my mind were all the letters and all the threats and all the mess that I find myself in, some of it out of my own making. In that very moment, what he didn't know was that just minutes before this worship service began, one of the antagonists in my congregation swore that I would not spend another Sunday as a pastor of that church. In that very moment, I too wanted to craft an image and just give the people what they wanted. Oh, I get Aaron. And if you've been in leadership here, whether you've been in leadership in your business, or whether you've been in leadership in your family, or whether you've been in leadership in the church, or whether you've been in leadership in a civic group, you know those moments of leadership. I also understand the people. I get it. Their leader had been up for so long, and they were getting a little desperate. They were in the middle of a wilderness. Things were not looking very good. The miracle worker, Moses, who constantly was praying to God for water and food and all the things they needed, was no longer there. And they began to wonder, well, what are we going to do? And it's typical of any community, whether you're talking about a neighborhood or a city or a church or a family, that when anxiety and fear rise, we too wonder, what are we going to do? And often what we think we want is not what we need at all. This is why often as a pastor, when someone sits in my office in the middle of a crisis, I say something like this: never make a life-altering decision in the middle of a crisis. Because we're not at our best. So this community was not at its best. They were just desperate for something. So they looked to their leader for an answer. But because the leader himself was not at his best, chaos ensued. So then I begin to imagine what would have made it differently. One of my favorite writers, Gordon Lathrop, he's a liturgical theologian, and he says that priests, pastors, have only a few tools at their disposal in the exercise of priesthood. They have the story of faith. They have cup. They have bread. They have water. And they have oil for anointing. Those are the only tools that we have to exercise this priestly work. So it got me thinking, in light of our own life and circumstance, what about those tools for all of us? See, we are part of a Protestant tradition that has taken great pride in understanding called the priesthood of all believers. That means that all of us, yes, for sure, have an opportunity. We often say it like this. We often say, well, it's that we don't need a mediator to reach God. And that's partially true. In other words, God doesn't need a mediator to reach us. But I began to think, in priesthood, part of what we do is we do mediate. God doesn't need mediation, but often we need mediation. And here's what came to mind. When I was a child and I needed something, I would often know which parent I needed to go to get what I wanted. So depending on what my spiel was, I would go to mom or dad. You learn the personalities, you know who's going to get you what. So I would play the little game there. And the game was really a lot of fun until I became a parent. But there were those moments, though, when even though I thought I had read the room right, Dad would say, no. So then I would go to Mom. Now, I knew the answer. I knew Mom would say, what did your dad say? And I would have to admit, well, Dad said no. But often Mom would let me give her my spiel anyway. And so I would plead my case. And though it didn't happen very often, I was amazed at times that in the next 24-hour cycle, something amazing would happen. Dad would change his mind. I don't know what kind of magic my mother would utilize, but she would mediate on my behalf. See, in our lives with God is true. God doesn't need us to have mediators, but we often need mediators. And that's why we have a priesthood of all believers. We who are gathered here, we truly mediate for one another. So imagine what a different story this would have been if Aaron, in the midst of his struggles, and in the midst of his sense of self that was a little kind of off, in the middle of his insecurities, in the middle of the reality of his circumstance, he would have just engaged the community and used the tools that he had at his disposal. He would remind them of their shared story. He would remind them that not too long before, they had seen the Red Sea parting so that they could have a way. He would have reminded them that not too long before, they had been slaves in Egypt, and yet God freed them into a promised land. They would have been reminded that in spite of all their hunger and their thirst, that every single crisis moment, God had been there providing for every single need. They would have been reminded that as they were standing there desperate and wondering that they could still see the cloud of God's presence up the mountain, they would have been reminded that there was no need to create other gods. The temptation is there for sure. And before we get too judgy about these Israelites, we too love to create our own gods. Oh, they might not have the shape of a Baal, or we might even get a little iffy about statues, but the reality of it is that humans have a penchant for creating gods so that we can have deities that we can control. Deities that agree with us, deities that give us exactly what we think we need, deities that will give us the answers that we prefer, deities that look a lot like us and who like the people we like and dislike the people we dislike. And so it's a lot easier to create deities than it is to remember that at the end of the day, the one true God of love and acceptance and new life, that is the God who is with us in this very moment, in the midst of our uncertainty, in the midst of our struggle, in the midst of our questions, in the midst of our trials and tribulations. And I'm wondering today, as we're gathered for worship, you priest, you people of God, are we being called to minister to one another, to remind each other of the story? Because I know as we're gathered here for worship, in the midst of the hymns we sing and the prayers we say, in the midst of the attentive listening that we are doing, so many of us are gathered here knowing the struggles of our own hearts. Many of us questioning and wondering, will God be faithful this time? Many of us having doubts about our own exercise of leadership, about our own ways in which the decisions we have to make tomorrow or this afternoon. Many of us are finding ourselves in the place that the Israelites found themselves, and we have a decision to make. Are we going to allow that stuff to guide our decision making and our next steps, or are we going to call upon the God that has been faithful all along? The God of community, the God of story, the God of grace, the God of new life, the miracle worker, the God whose love has been sufficient before. People of God, I'm so glad for a story about incompetent priesthood and stiff-necked people. That's us. That is us. And I'm so glad of the story of a God who, in spite of our mess-ups, continues to guide us to our journey into the promised land. Thanks be to God. Amen.